Hi, thank you for joining me today. My name is John New. This is John 2020 Apologetics, and today's video is going to be on the resurrection or the resurrection on trial. So, as St. Athanasius says, and St. Paul, that our whole faith, our whole belief system is based upon the resurrection of Jesus. His bodily death, as St. Athanasius says, is indeed the very center of our faith, and St. Paul in 1 Corinthians says this as well. That if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. Your faith is also in vain. Extremely important topic. This is why Lee Strobel went after the resurrection when he wrote The Case for Christ in his book. That's why he went after the resurrection when his wife converted to Christianity. He wanted to disprove Christianity. So he went after the resurrection, and through his studies, he obviously became a world-renowned author on the subject. So today's objective of this video, so I want to be crystal clear. This is what I'm trying to show you here. Okay, is to show in a hypothetical court setting the evidence would support the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth under Pontius Pilate, which did occur, which led to the resurrection of Jesus. And it's more probable than possible he did resurrect, and it would take more faith to believe otherwise. And we're going to go over all the different types of evidences that courtrooms accept. If you're new to my channel, by the way, I'm a police officer, so I am doing this through a forensic statement analysis lens, and I'll explain some of that later. But before we get started, there are some things I want you to consider while watching this video. Okay, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and it's easily one of the most secure beliefs in all of antiquity, in the New Testament especially. Okay, virtually all scholars from atheists to Christians agree that Jesus Christ was a person, a historical figure that walked the earth, and he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Now, of course, I believe that he's God in the flesh. So, but let's at least start off with the vast majority of scholars agree that he was a historical person. Okay. Also, another thing that they accept. 500 plus people claimed to have seen Jesus of Nazareth post-crucifixion. This experience then did change their lives forever, and this group of 500 plus witnesses were a mix of believers and non-believers, so skeptics and non-skeptics. So this is an historical fact that this is what occurred. Now they could be wrong if you're a skeptic, right? I don't believe what they saw, but they believed what they saw. Those people believe that they saw the risen Jesus. No doubt. Okay? No doubt. That doesn't prove that Jesus rose, but it proves that these people did believe that. But it would be the other person's obligation to prove that they didn't see Jesus and go against the claim. All right? So, yeah, and this was a mix of believers and non-believers, educated to fishermen, and this experience did change their life, where they were even being tortured for this belief, and they still didn't care. They still kept pressing on, preaching about the resurrection of Jesus. And we'll dig into more of that later. The belief in Jesus as the Son of God, the eternal Son of the Father, exploded through the area shortly after his crucifixion. We already have earliest Christian churches in Jerusalem in the first council held by St. James. This was an accumulation of all the eyewitnesses who experienced Jesus of Nazareth post-crucifixion. There was no disagreement about his resurrection miracle or any detail of his experience. The only disagreement was about if the Gentiles needed the law of Moses. So understand, this was an accumulation of first century Jews who all experienced, the resurrection or the resurrected Jesus. They all saw him face to face. Okay, and they all came together. And no one disagreed with their experience. There's no record of them arguing about it. And they argued all the time. Even the apostles in front of Jesus argued about who was the greatest amongst them. Okay. You have here, shortly after the resurrection of Jesus, where the church is already having a disagreement if the Gentiles should keep the law of Moses. So there was absolute plenty of times where they disagreed with each other all the time. Paul corrects Peter multiple times in the New Testament as well. It's not like they didn't disagree with each other. So they all weren't holding hands singing Kumbaya. This is an extremely important point that I think gets brushed over, that there was no disagreement on this. And there was no disagreement on the early church, which Paul records a hymn later, and we're going to go over that in a second. Okay? Paul of Tarsus reports of a Christian creed, and here it is, already in circulation by the church, which prays the resurrection and mentions the witnesses. This creed was already being circulated by the late 40s, which means it had been cited earlier than the late 40s. Some scholars have it dated up until maybe a year or two post resurrection of Jesus. So this is an extremely early creed, and Paul wrote 1 Corinthians around 50 AD, and he's already quoting it, saying that they already had it in circulation. How long did it take to get that in circulation against a persecuted church? Think about that. All right. And the government bodies which were around the Christians hated our belief and were persecuted by them far more than any other belief system. And here's just my speculation. But it's very odd to treat a non-violent small sect of believers this way who pose no physical harm. Thank you for your time. Now let's get started. And so, again, I believe the reason why they treated our early church brothers and sisters this way, because as the scripture says, and as the church teaches, that the world hates. The world hates Jesus. And I believe that those miracles and those experiences that they experienced, the people who saw that weren't Christian, it scared them. And we'll go over more of that later. But before we get started, I'm going to go over some objections, some fun objections that people like to throw at. And it's going to seem like I'm mostly defending the scripture here most of the time, but and that may be true, but the reason is because it is a majority of our source of information. So since the vast majority of evidence that I'm going to support, I will bring circumstantial evidence with all this as well later. But I at least need to set up that the witness of the New Testament is reliable. So I'm going to attack and destroy some of the common objections that just make absolute no sense. And I don't know if people's ever really thought these things through. Okay, so before I go over the types of evidence that are in the courtroom, which we're going to go over in a second, that's a boring part. So, but let's go over these common objections. There's just 5. There's plenty more, but these are the common top 5. Okay, this is what skeptics, atheists, Muslims like to make, and most of it does revolve around textual criticism. Okay, so the objection 1. So some of the New Testament writings don't have an author named. Therefore, the integrity of this statement or the gospel writings can be in jeopardy. So remember, this is a court setting, so I'm treating the New Testament writings as if they were affidavits, or they're written by an eyewitness, because some of them were, some of them are not, some of them are expert witness statements. Okay, so and we're going to go over that as well. I'm going to unpack all this. Okay, but so their argument is that if you don't have your name on it, then it doesn't prove anything. You can't be reliable. That's absolutely ridiculous. It's a ridiculous stance to take. Makes no sense whatsoever. All kinds of reliable witnesses are used in court is from unnamed sources, informants, or even a unanimous noise complaint. Like, for instance, we get people that call all the time. There's gunshots on Main Street. What's your name? I'm not telling you. I don't want any part of it. Click, and we show up, and there was or there was not gunshots. Okay, or there's a fight in the front yard, and I don't want any part of it because it's obviously someone in the neighborhood. They don't want any deal with the neighbors. Click, and then we show up and there's a fight. We don't answer the calls and go, oh, you know what? We're not going to send any officers over to check on that gunshot or that fight, that brawl in the front yard, because the person wouldn't give us their name. And also, courts take anonymous people's testimony all the time if it comes behind the safety of a police officer saying, here, this is their testimony and it can be trusted. Like for big court cases and drug cases and murder cases, like this is a silly argument. I don't know how people think this is a good one. Also, we find Civil War letters from World War I and World War II from soldiers, ancient geographical maps, ancient writings like the Rosetta Stone, which are unnamed, damaged, and they don't assume it's not reliable. You find a letter from a Civil War soldier and you don't got his name on it, and because it's been beaten down or it's been got a bullet hole through it or weathered through, now it's not all of a sudden a reliable letter because his name isn't on it. That's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. It's true or it's not. That's what matters. So I don't understand how this is like a good point. So a simple explanation for this, though. So there are reasons why some of the gospels were not named. And it's for a smart reason, by the way, because if I've already mentioned multiple times that the earliest Christians were persecuted. Okay, and they were fed to lions and whatnot. They lived a very tough life. This is one of the many examples where Christians behave like common criminals today because they were treated like criminals. Now, I'm not saying Christians are criminals. I'm saying they had to act like criminals because they were treated as such. And I'm probably going to do a video on this later. It's fascinating. This historical reality is showcased in the New Testament, which just adds validity and authenticity to the eyewitness and how it's a reflection of the historical reality. To further expound on this point, Mark does not list the name of Peter, who cut off the ear of the soldier, even though the Gospel of Mark is a conglomerate of teachings of Peter, who in fact it was Peter who cut the ear off. And that's St. Mark writes that in Mark 14. This is one way we date the book of Mark, by the way, because Peter was still alive when it was written. This would be to protect Peter from being hunted down at the time in history, because a strike on the soldier is the same thing as a strike on the king. So that's one way we can date it, but there's reasons why people didn't put their names on things. Okay, I could go on and on about this, but we literally get calls from unanimous people all the time about crimes, and I just went over that with you. It doesn't mean that it's not a reliable source because the person isn't named. Okay, and it doesn't take away from the eyewitness either. You can have an anonymous eyewitness as well. So you're gonna have to give me something better than that. Objection 2: the Gospels have different details, even possibly contradiction. Excuse me. Therefore, the integrity of the writing is in question. All right, let's do a thought experiment. Okay, if you arrive on scene and two guys were fighting, Bill and Bob, and the four eyewitnesses, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, write you their affidavits or the witness statements, because remember, I'm treating the New Testament Gospels as affidavits, as the witness statement, as an eyewitness, or in this case, 4 Gospels. What should be the first red flag? Conclusion: that would mean it would bring their integrity down if they all matched exactly the same. If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are reporting about Bill and Bob getting in a fight, and all 4 Gospels read the exact same, that would actually bring the integrity down. If you arrive on scene and 2 guys got in a fight and everyone writes the exact same affidavit, that's not a red flag to you, because it takes away the natural perspective of the eyewitness, because they're not all getting from the same perspective. And here's an example that I've experienced many times. We go on a traffic crash all the time. One eyewitness says a green truck was hit by a Mazda. The other guy says a blue truck was hit by a Mazda. That doesn't mean that the crash didn't occur. I see a crashed car right there. The green or the blue Mazda drove off. Doesn't mean the crash didn't occur because somebody said it was blue, the other person said it was green. Although there is no contradicting, there's still a difference in perspective. This brings solid forensic statement analysis evidence that John is an eyewitness, by the way, and Matthew is an eyewitness, and Mark is relaying teachings, and Luke is an expert witness who writes also in the first person in Acts later, in plural, first person plural, excuse me. For me to prove that, and here's the difference too, is that historical reliability and proving something historically is not the same thing as proving something scientifically. Genghis Khan sacks a village. I don't need to have him sack the village again to prove that he sacked the village. But I do need to freeze water at 32 degrees over time in a container and do it again and again and again and replicate it, and then say, look, when the temperature gets 32 degrees and it's around H2O, it will freeze. And I can repeat that. That's how scientific reliability is made, not historical. Historical doesn't have to be reenacted. I don't have to have that car hit by a green or a blue Mazda again, and I don't need Genghis Khan to resack a village to prove that he sacked that village, or that there was a car wreck that drove off, a hit and run. It's ridiculous. And speaking of St. John and St. Luke, so expert 3, so no expert declared Jesus to be dead. So there are Muslims and atheists who will come to the conclusion that yes, there was historical Jesus and he was crucified, but no expert person said that Jesus was fully dead. So he would have to be dead to resurrect. So therefore, you can't say for certain that he even died to resurrect. So just getting rid of the fighting against the idea of Jesus resurrecting, they'll just go a step before that and say, hey, he never even died. He was maybe put on the cross, but maybe he was healed it up or brought back later, or some type of, way through the apostles and through the women that were there, something like that. So now here's how you answer that. This is also very simple. All right, so this point will actually prove the eyewitness of St. John. It actually demonstrates how reliable St. John's eyewitness is, because he was the only apostle at the crucifixion. There were others at the crucifixion, but St. John was the only apostle who gutted up and went to the crucifixion. Okay. Yes, it's true. The only apostle crucifixed was John. And yes, he was not a medical doctor like Luke to declare Jesus had died. So Luke, by the way, was like a historian, a physician. However, the fact that John describes the water pocket around the heart being pierced in John 19, how else could he have known about this? He has no medical background. So I will concede to your argument that he's not a medical doctor like Luke. Okay. So how does he know about rare medical conditions that occur when someone is going through a traumatic experience like the crucifixion? Who taught him that? So you have to account for that. All right, I'm going to give you a very simple example here in a second. The most probable answer is that it was experiential. The Gospel of John reads as an eyewitness, especially a medically uneducated one. St. Luke, a physician, then goes on to describe the sweating of the blood Jesus experienced right before the crucifixion, Luke 22. So Luke does write in a more of a physician manner. John does not, but he does describe something that only a physician should know. Also, it should be noted the crucifixion and persecution of Christians was a way of life. Just look into the original Roman candle is, where Christians were burned through the night. That's where you get the term Roman candle. They would light Christians on fire with oil and they would burn through the night on top of their head. Right? Crucifixion was a public display. This stuff was all public. It wasn't like it was in a dungeon somewhere. If they did not properly put to death, by the way, the soldiers themselves paid with their lives. And Jesus was allowed off the cross with their permission. Okay. St. John and Mary didn't go up there and start spin kicking the guards and get him down. They allowed him to come down. So let's do a quick thought experiment, because thought experiments are the best way to try to handle something and see if it's objectively true or not. Okay. Think of it as let's see here. Sorry about that. That StreamYard duck in the top right was bothering me. Okay. So let's do a quick thought experiment in regards to St. John. I think it's fair we camp more on him because he is an eyewitness. Okay. And he was the only apostle who was at the crucifixion. So I think it's fair to criticize him heavily and to camp on him as well. In particular, I want to do a comparison with the simple fact a young fisherman with no medical background described an eyewitness testimony of Jesus experienced the pericardial effusion, which is a buildup of fluid layers around the heart due to great physical illness or injury. Okay, so now picture your detective. And there's a new gang that just moved in town called the Lost Boys Atheist Gang. And they believe in crazy things like matter and energy comes from nothing. Morals are relative, and there's no objective truth. And they're a very unhinged group. All right. So, a teenage boy, nobody knows about this gang. And not very few people, like detectives and things, officers, it wasn't common knowledge. A teenage boy calls the police and says a big man just kicked in the door. next door by his house. And of course, this is alarming. But then then the young man, says, with no knowledge about the Lost Boys atheist gang, because only a select few people know about them, describes a big man wearing a leather cutoff jacket with a snake and dagger in black and yellow, just like that one right there. Just like that one right there. This, of course, brings more credibility. It isn't a prank, but a real eyewitness. He couldn't know this. He either observed it or it's a wild, wild guess. And which is more possible and which is more probable. So John could have not known this. He was a fisherman. He lacked the education, and this actually backfires due to the fact that he himself accurately describes a medical condition which he did not know about, which would occur under the extreme pressure and circumstances under a crucifixion. And he wrote it as an eyewitness. Objective 4. The New Testament was written years later, after the fact, from the historical events recording. Therefore, the integrity of the witness is in jeopardy. So if you were to ask someone to recall a random day in the past with no significance, for instance, a Tuesday, of course this would be an issue. No one denies that. So recalling information is the critique. Can they recall it accurately? The difference is, though, when something traumatic or life-changing does happen, recall is remarkably good. Now, I'm just granting this, by the way, that the writings from Paul and the Gospels are written decades later. Not all scholars agree on that, but let's just grant it and say it's true. Let's just say it's true, even though James was written maybe 8 to 10 years post-resurrection. Let's just grant it, okay? So the difference is when something dramatic or life-changing happens, recall is remarkably good. Even just small repeated events like, say, a college schedule or your first-time job can be called with accuracy. My freshman year, I walked the sidewalk every Monday to biology, then hit the cafeteria and set it as that exact table as an example. Here's a study which supports this. Pause the video if you care to look it up. Of course, generally, the more significant the event, the more clarity one can recall. For instance, can two old lovebirds recall their wedding? Or how about their first date? Or how about Pearl Harbor? Or how about D-Day survivor? Decades later on the History Channel giving a monologue. You can't recall where you were at 9/11 if you're an old fart like me? The History Channel doesn't give a disclaimer when an old war hero in his 70s recalls a battle from Vietnam. Doesn't say, disclaimer, he could be wrong. You take him for his word because he's talking about watching his buddies and start singing Alice in Chains and Rooster, right? So the courts see this the same way as well, by the way, because this is our court setting, right? So there is no statute of limitations for SA crimes or felony batteries. The victim's recall can be faithfully accurate. Now put yourselves in the sandals. See how I did that? The sandals of an eyewitness of Jesus. Regardless if you personally believe he is the God-man, the eternal Logos, the second person of the Godhead or not. The writers clearly did. Maybe they're crazy, maybe. But they clearly did believe that about Jesus. There's no doubt about it. Okay, St. James, the earliest writing we have in the New Testament, which appears to be an eyewitness, calls himself a bondservant of Jesus in the opening of his writing. A doulos, the Greek word, Koine Greek word for bondservant or slave. James, the leader of the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, which happened in 49 AD. Clearly his writings had to be before that, because shortly after that he was martyred. Why was he martyred? For his belief in Jesus, by the way. So I bring this up to show, even though the Gospels were written decades after their experience with Jesus, I'm just granting that, and the majority of Paul's epistles, St. James' writings are very, very, very early to the resurrection of Jesus. We're talking 12, 15 years post-resurrection. Paul quotes a creed early in the church in 1 Corinthians 15, which I went over this earlier, and I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. For I delivered to you first of all which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. After that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, from whom the greater part remain to the present. But some have fallen asleep. After that, he was seen by James and then all the apostles. Then last of all, he was seen by me also as one born out of due time. Objection 5. If you accept just an eyewitness account of the New Testament, then an eyewitness must be accepted to be consistent, i.e. an eyewitness of Bigfoot, aliens, mermaids. It's just an eyewitness is not enough. Of course, I agree. An eyewitness can't be enough. That's why you have to investigate it. But that's also a straw man. That's also not the position of the New Testament. It's not just an eyewitness. It has corroborating evidence that supports the eyewitness, and it's massive. And I can't wait to show it to you. Can't wait. So this is true. The assumption, however, is the evidence for the resurrection is just an eyewitness. So the claim is if Bob and Bill say they met Bigfoot, now we have two eyewitnesses. There is no different than St. John and St. Thomas meeting Jesus after the crucifixion. This, of course, is a false equivalency. The comparison falls flat on its face due to the fact the evidence is just an eyewitness. It's not just an eyewitness. There is other threads of compounding evidence, which is in agreement with the eyewitness. And what are those? In essence, the rest of my presentation, I'll definitely answer this question. I will have a pleasure demonstrating this. But first, a real dry part of this presentation is going to be brings the types of evidences which are used in a courtroom. This will be, again, dry, but I'll try to get through these as quickly as possible. It is important we understand what the different types of evidence is and how each one can be used to support a claim. It's important we distinguish this by process of elimination. So roughly 20 different types of evidence in a courtroom. So remember, we're proving a historical event. Historical events do and are not proved through the scientific method. And I already went through the scientific method with you about the water or a car traveling 60 miles per hour. How long is it going? 2 hours. These are examples are observed and repeated in this process, given the same outcome. That is a scientific method. But historical evidence, methodology, or historiography is different. Okay, critical examination of source, primary, and secondary material from archaeology. This section of particular details from the authentic materials in those sources and synthesize of those details into a narrative that stands to test critical examination. An example is I gave Genghis Khan earlier. All right, so now let's go over the types of evidences because I'm rehashing again on purpose. I want to rehash it on purpose so you understand. So real evidence is physical evidence. So it's just tangible articles such as hairs, fibers, latent fingerprints. You have documentary evidence, okay, which is like passports, photo IDs, anything with writing on it, kind of what we have right now, isn't it? Maps, plans, graphs, drawings. What about demonstrative evidence? That's photographs, video material, x-rays, testimonial evidence is what we have here. Written or spoken, also called direct evidence or prima facie evidence, okay? And then we have some more breakdowns of direct evidence, which is generally speaking, there are two primary evidences, direct and circumstantial. This is what evidence is accepted, direct or circumstantial. Direct evidence, is name and applies, is evidence that directly links a defendant to the crime for which they were on trial. An example would be a sworn testimony of an eyewitness. Okay, or circumstantial evidence. On the other hand, circumstantial evidence is evidence that implies a person did commit the crime. For example, while direct evidence might include a witness directly seeing a defendant commit a crime, circumstantial would be a witness seeing a defendant fleeing a crime scene. In circumstantial cases, there must be a multitude of such evidence compiled for any real impact. Multitude. So if I didn't see Bob rob the bank, but I'm riding through the bank parking lot to put in my paycheck, and I see Bob running out there as fast as he can with a big bag over his back, and he's got a clown mask that falls out of his back pocket to his car and speeds off. Did he actually see the bank robbery? Or is that circumstantial evidence that he witnessed the defendant fleeing a crime? And so you can prove crimes that way too. Physical evidence. So objects found on the ground, like a weapon, things like individual evidence, DNA, striations fired in a bullet. You can pause this video and you can read all this if you want. Get more detail. I am trying to speed through this. Okay. I don't know how long this video is going to be. It's going to be long. All right. So class physical evidence, examples of class evidence include blood type, tread patterns, forensic evidence, excuse me. All right. So forensic evidence is DNA matching fingerprints, hair. Trace evidence is, included gunshot residue, hair fibers. Testimonial witness evidence is the witness statement. Again, expert witness statements is like if a doctor says, I agree with the witness statement. Digital evidence is cameras and whatnot, and documentary evidence is like a deed or a will. Demonstrative evidence is models, and you get the point. Okay, you got character evidence, habit evidence. Habit evidence might be something that we will hit on. That is that you see someone routinely do something, and then you can use it as evidence. Like I saw Bill routinely jogs around the neighborhood at 6 a.m. There was a person who was beat up on that same trail at 6:15 a.m. and it kind of matches the description. Even though you didn't see it, but you have neighbors that are in the neighborhood and they know that Bob or Bill always jogs that same route at 6 o'clock, and that's when the person said it happened. So you can use like habit evidence like that. Hearsay evidence that's inadmissible in court. Corroborating evidence is what we will be using. Exploratory evidence that justifies or excuses a reasonable doubt to defend the allegations or the intentions. Admissible, inadmissible, insufficient. Okay, you get the point. I'm sorry. I hope you didn't quit on me and you made it through that type of evidences for me. All right, so trigger warning to you skeptics, okay? Trigger warning. Keep your feelings away. Keep your feelings away. So a quick message addressing the skeptic watching this video. First, I appreciate you watching. I'm not trolling you. I do appreciate it. I do hope that you repent and you come to Christ True Church, the Orthodox Church, and you do accept Christ as your God and Savior. So first, I appreciate that, and but I have answered a few common objections, and I will answer a few more which are generally against the Bible. That's normally what they attack. And I would love, by the way, anyone watching this video, if you ever want to have a discussion on the reliability of the New Testament, please send me a message, and I'll bring you on my channel, and we can talk about it. I look forward to doing that with someone. But before I do that, please consider internally critiquing, since you like to critique people of faith, which is fine. Internally critique your own position. Okay? Internally critique that. So what is hard for today, especially young people's generation, to understand is crimes were solved in the past without forensic, trace, digital evidence, to name a few. Critical thinking has weakened with today's generation, no doubt. Their presuppositions are mixed with laziness and surface level understanding, and they have infected their outlook. TikTok brain is what I like to call it. Eventually, they become their own authority and make absurd standards like, if I didn't see it or if I didn't experience it, X can't be trusted, as if they're the beacon of all things. This is a beautiful example of circular reasoning with no paradigm, by the way. For thousands of years, or only up to 2 decades ago, circumstantial, independent, and eyewitness and direct and expert witness and testimony witness, and sometimes even trace evidence were the key types to determine if X had or had not occurred. Not everything has to be on video or recorded. Okay? Please allow me to make this point very clear. It isn't as if this generation is empirically driven, entirely evidence-based. So you also contradict yourself. They have faith in all types of things. You skeptics, you young folks, you have faith in all types of things. You just choose not to have faith into this. They believe these beliefs are protected by some force field, like a magic Harry Potter spell when they blurt out science or studies or I disagree. For instance, belief matter and energy space can come from nothing. Life came from non-living material. They do not deep dive into their presuppositions. They buy over the counter and test the authenticity over the lab, investigate the medical professions are involved, and just take it for face value. Whenever you buy something over the counter, you don't do some deep dive investigation to see if that's an authentic doctor or not, to see if that's some type of prescription that's really in there or not. You don't break out a microscope. You don't do any of that stuff. You don't dissect any of these things. So you do base upon things upon faith from a source that you consider to be reliable. but you have no evidence to support that they're reliable. You're just going off of face value. So again, you are basing something on faith. They also don't test the octane that they put in their gas or find out the pipeline that it came from. You work off faith all the time. But make no mistake, okay, there are always been skeptics. St. John, an apostle who was known as Doubting Thomas, did not believe the resurrection until he observed the evidence himself. That's what my channel is named after, John 20:28, is Doubting Thomas. He did not believe that Jesus Christ had resurrected because he hadn't seen it for himself. Even the apostles told him that Jesus Christ resurrected. He still didn't believe it, and Jesus had to show up to him in person. And he stuck his fingers through his holes in his hands, and that's when he determined that he was indeed Jesus. So skeptic, I'm not criticizing you for being skeptic. I'm criticizing you for not having equal scales to your skepticism. Okay? It's not equally applied. The Bible, Jesus teaches to use discernment. You can be skeptical. We want you to be. So there is an agreement here. Again, it's just not equally applied. There's also there is also done with independent eyewitnesses as well. One more example before we continue. As a police officer, it can be hard on us sometimes with the public eye on social media. A lot of it is self-inflicted, no doubt. Officers need to do better. We can and should do better. Perhaps that is for another video. With that said, here's what happened. This is an actual thing that occurred in this area. It was reported on social media a police officer was driving and slowed to a four-way stop. At this point, all three other stop signs had a vehicle stopped at it as well. It's a four-way stop. The police officer, using courtesy, sat at the stop sign while the other cars went. Also at this time, his radio went off and his work cell phone. Moments before the stop, which was work-related, the phone call was work-related. Even more reason, by the way, for him to sit at ease, because his phone's going off, the radio's going off, and everyone kind of gets to the stop sign at the same time. He maybe was there first by a split second. The cars then drove off as the police officer went last. What's the big deal? Well, a few hours later, one of the person at the four-way stop went to social media and vented. The complaint was from his observation, the police officer didn't wave, just sat at the four-way stop and was, quote, on their phone. No benefit of doubt was given. But again, this isn't the issue I'm raising. The issue is people went in agreement with that independent eyewitness. There was no questioning. No one inquired about the integrity of that person, their history, who they were and are. What if he was a criminal? What if he was a retired police officer? So to even support the claim. No one did any of that. Criminals could hurt the integrity. A criminal would have hurt the integrity, and the cop would strengthen it. The point is, it was believed on blind faith. And normally the people who just jumped in line to agree with this gentleman venting on social media already have a preconceived notion about cops in a negative light. So it is easy for them to believe in that. This is just one of millions of examples of faith being used by people who claim to be skeptical. For the record, this is a single independent eyewitness, by the way, which was reported at the four-way stop, unlike the New Testament, which is an independent eyewitness, was corroborating as well with expert, hostile, and outside of the New Testament, more hostile witnesses, which, again, we'll get into later. So there's the inconsistency of handling of the evidence. By far, the New Testament has more evidence that would support Jesus resurrecting than the police officer sitting at the four-way stop, but that was taken on complete blind faith in one person's eyewitness. Supposedly. And circumstantial evidence also works to prove an event occurred. It does take a lot to prove. Remember how we mentioned this earlier, that circumstantial evidence is an accumulation. It's like a picture of a weather balloon. It's got a bunch of needles and you're poking in it to bring it down. That's how circumstantial evidence works. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. Note, I'm highlighting these examples to prove a point. The evidence of the resurrection of Jesus is stronger and has more evidence than what has previously been discussed. You can even prove something without an independent eyewitness with the cumulative nature of circumstantial evidence. So basically, so much circumstantial evidence that builds to a point that it takes more faith to believe the opposite. So it's more probable than possible now. because so much circumstantial evidence. Now the example. So now we're getting to it. And this isn't hypothetical. I will use some of the real circumstantial evidence left by the Night Stalker with Richard Ramirez on Netflix. So this is some of the stuff that got him arrested. Okay? So but this is the hypothetical situation by him involving some of the circumstances that got him arrested. So say someone reported a welfare check on their friend Bob Taylor. Bob Taylor. I haven't heard from Bob in a long time. We get these calls all the time. I need someone to check on. They hadn't heard from Bob. So a cop responds to Bob's address and knocks with no answer. So he's knocking on the door. No one's answering. And there's a car, but his car's in the driveway. You run the license tag, it's his car. No points of breach, no broken windows. You do walk around the house. No, there's no doors that's been kicked in. There's no windows that are cracked. Nothing. Then you could smell a stench. It smells like a dead body. Police officers know that smell. So many of y'all probably do as well. And you look over and you see the newspapers that have piled up as well. And there's mail in the mailbox dating a week ago. And there's several packages on the doorstep. Cop goes by all the windows and again checks all the blinds. And he could see, you know how you can kind of see little holes in the blinds. And you can see the TV still playing. And it looks like there's a leg or a part of a body laying next to the TV as it's flickering on and off. Okay. This officer more than likely has probable cause to enter the residence. Once in, the officer finds Bob on the ground with a smashed head from a blunt object and a puncture wounds from a knife. He's no longer with us. Can the officer now figure out what happened? Who did it? No eyewitness, no fingerprints. He sweeps the place. There's no fingerprints. There's no security cameras. No neighbors have cameras. No ring door camera. None of that. Can he prove who did it through circumstantial evidence? Yeah. And that's not real. That's a dummy. Okay. It's a dummy. So now let's investigator goes over and looks at Bob. And this is what he determines from Bob. Okay. Bob's right side of his head is bashed in. And all the stab punctures are rotating left as well. Is it reasonable to believe the killer is left-handed? Yeah. It's reasonable. Bob's house was not broken into, excuse me. Is it reasonable to believe Bob either let the killer in or has keys? Yes. Which could also lead to Bob possibly knowing the killer. It's reasonable. Bob is a smaller male. Outside of his front door was a footprint size 13. Bob wears a size 9. Is it reasonable to believe the footprint would be the killer? Yes. Could it be the package delivery guy? Yes. So let's say you then track down UPS and find a delivery guy and find out what his shoe size he was that day. You find out the delivery guy that dropped off the package those days. And they're all the same guy, size 10. And it's a different shoe print than the shoe print that was left. So now it's more reasonable. Yeah, it's more reasonable. So then the shoe print is from a rare shoe brand. This is the actual piece of evidence was got the Night Stalker, by the way. And there is only one shoe store in the country which sells it. Let's call the shoe Nike All-Stars. So Bob's house, so let's review. Bob's house has a faint smell Then Bob's house has a faint smell of bleach as well, especially by the front door. The whole house is a mess besides by Bob's body. Is it reasonable to believe the killer cleaned up the scene after the murder? Yes. That the whole house is, he's a bachelor. Everything's dirty besides by his body. And it still has a hint smell of bleach. Is it reasonable? Yes. Next up, you ask a few neighbors if they knew Bob and call any family members to see who Bob might have given keys to the house, because now you're trying to figure out how this person got in. There's no breach of entry. So the family members say they don't know anyone that fits that. However, a neighbor did say she observed a large male from time to time bring over wings and pizza, even walks Bob's dog from time to time, stating that the large male would just walk in having his own keys. So then the officer goes on that large male's social media and finds Bill Smith, a friend of Bob. They're friends on Facebook. And it shows pictures of him watching football over at his house and his dog licking his face. So the officer arrives to Bill's house and begins to ask him questions. So now you at least maybe possibly have a lead. So then you go to Bill's house. Bill writes a statement. He asks him what happened, where he was that night. Bill says, I was out on the beach, and we're going to get that in a second. But he writes it with his left hand. Oh, and lo and behold, Bob is a large male. Bill is a large male. And oh, lo and behold, Bill is a size 13 shoe. He's writing with his left hand with the pen. He's a bigger guy. Okay, maybe it's possible. It's a coincidence. It's possible. The detective reads Bill's statement where he was on the night Bob was killed, and his alibi doesn't make any sense, though. So Bill says he is, and this is why digging through forensic statement or through written statements like a forensic is so important, which is what I do with the New Testament. Bill says he is a close friend with Bob. He walks his dog. He even has a key. Okay, so he's admitted to having a key. They even went to grade school together. He said he went for a walk on the beach all day, the day that Bob was unalived. However, the detective recalls that there was a lightning storm that day, and Bill complexion, he's a very fair-skinned guy. He has no signs of suntan, no sunburn, no sun kiss, nothing. That seems odd. So he could put on a lot of sunscreen. It's possible, but it doesn't seem to go with that. And plus, it was thunderstorming that day. You then contact the shoe store nearest to his house and find they have had 20 pairs of those Nike All-Stars sold in the last 6 months. 3 of them are size 13 or greater. All the credit card records is the first initial and the last name of the person who purchased it. It reads B. Smith. Now remember, this is a rare purchase of a shoe, and again, this is one of the reasons why the Night Stalker got caught. But it is a common name. It's a common name. Plus, the size of the country is 500, or a county is 500,000 people. But is it reasonable now to have him as a suspect? It's reasonable. And the other 2 B. Smiths who bought those shoes, one sent a pair of those shoes to his nephew in Texas, and the other one is a retired old man in his early 80s. So there is a pair of people who did buy that rare shoe who is named B. Smith, but he's 80 years old. And he doesn't know, there's no link to Bob. So what's more reasonable, Bill or Bob? Or excuse me, Bill or this old man in his 80s? The detective writes all this up, and then the judge reads it and then signs a search warrant. That will absolutely get you a search warrant, no question. And in Bill's house, when you go into Bill's house, surprise, to do a search warrant, you find a bat with jeans under a black light, lights up for bleach. No beach sand on his mat by his front door or on his car mats or any trace elsewhere. And has a pair of All-Stars in his closet. So didn't find any evidence of the beach sand. Said he went on a beach. There was no sand on the beach. Nothing on anywhere in his house. He could be a clean guy. It's reasonable. But there's none on his car mats. Could be a clean guy. It's reasonable. Okay, but he does got a pair of All-Stars in his closet. Is it coincidence? It's possible. Let's see how this accumulation is starting to add up. So let's recap so far. Beach alibi makes no sense. He's left-handed. He wears a size 13 shoe, owns a pair of rare shoes, size 13, has keys, was let in with no breach point, or was let in, because, he could have knocked on the door, could have been let in. Bleach stains on a bat, bleach stains on jeans, and he's a physically much larger male. So what's more reasonable? All this coincidence or Bill unalived Bob? What's more probable? Not possible, probable. The main channels of evidence in this section. So what I just did, and I used circumstantial evidence. I just used circumstantial evidence, an accumulation of circumstantial evidence to prove that he was the killer. That's just circumstantial. The resurrection is circumstantial and eyewitness and demonstrative and expert and the physical evidence that we're going to go over a second with archaeology. And there's a few others that I can't remember off the top of my head. So this is just that. So just like it's reasonable more reasonable, more probable than possible that Bill did kill Bob, we will look at the circumstantial evidence of the resurrection first. So we will go step by step through all the pieces of evidence. And then ask yourself, is it reasonable? Is it possible, or is it probable? Is it possible Bill didn't kill Bob and all those bullet points were just coincidence? It's possible, but it's not probable. It's possible while you're watching this video, you could be struck by a meteor, but it's not probable. There are other miracles of strange phenomena which did occur during the crucifixion and resurrection, which, like a rabbit trail on the circumstantial hostile evidence, can lead and support this main subject at hand. Now let's take a look. So there are other claims that are written by the New Testament, and it's recorded by people outside the New Testament, recording the same event, which did occur during the crucifixion and the resurrection. So it's circumstantial. Circumstantial evidence will be supported by a hostile witness, which is in agreement with the circumstantial evidence. Historical accounts will be in agreement with each other, having no common cultural language and belief system. Let's go over the circumstantial evidence. So I just gave you an example of Bill and Bob. So St. Matthew, an apostle of Jesus, who was an independent eyewitness in Matthew 9:9, Matthew 10:3, wrote of an historic event which occurred during the crucifixion and resurrection. So he's writing this as an eyewitness. Now, in the 6th hour, darkness fell upon the land until the 9th hour. Now, Matthew wasn't at the crucifixion, but notice he writes that it fell upon the land. He was not near the crucifixion. He wasn't there. He chickened out. Notice how that language indicates where he was. Fell upon the land. Matthew 27:50. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yelled up a spirit, and behold, the veil of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. So Matthew did meet with John later, and John does give him this intricate information. And also, you have here talking about a historical event which occurred. So is there any evidence so far of this stuff actually occurring? This eyewitness. Notice what he just claimed. Darkness fell, the earth shook. That's the claim by Matthew. This is circumstantial. Let's see. Here we read, during the crucifixion, which leads to the resurrection, the sun went dark for 3 hours, and there was an earthquake. Also, the sanctuary was torn in two as well. So that is 3 specific claims. The sun going black, or an eclipse does occur, something like that, an earthquake. But what are the chances of odds that occurred in a specific location, i.e. the temple being torn where Jesus was crucified? So it's not just earthquakes, it's earthquake which specifically happened in a location to proclaim what was happening. If there is a hostile witness which reported this phenomenon as well, so it's not just Matthew because he loves Jesus, there's even a hostile witness, a non-Christian source that says that this stuff happened as well, then this brings more argumentation to it. Okay, this brings more evidence that supports what it is, because this is not coming from someone who might be sympathetic of Jesus. And yeah, we have that. Thallus, a non-Christian historian in 52 AD, wrote a 5-volume set called The History of the World, quoted by Julius Africanus, the library inside the Parthenon, writing through Origen, trying to explain away the darkness during the crucifixion of Jesus. Not saying it didn't happen. He was a person who hated Christianity, a persecutor of Christians. He didn't claim that this stuff didn't happen. He's trying to answer for how it happened. That's a big distinction. On the whole world, they were oppressed in most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by the earthquake. And many places in Judea and the districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus in the 3rd book of Histories calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. For the Hebrews celebrate the Passover the 14th day according to the moon. The Passion of our Savior falls on the day before the Passover. But an eclipse of the sun takes place only when the moon comes under the sun. And it cannot happen at any other time but the interval between the first day of the new moon and the last of the old. How then should an eclipse be supposed to happen when the moon is mostly diametrically opposite of the sun? So let that opinion pass, however. Let it carry the majority with it. Let this portion of the world be deemed the eclipse of the sun. So he's basically saying, I know how eclipses occur, but it didn't occur like an eclipse, but I don't know what else to say what it was besides an eclipse. Phaliajon records this as well. In the time of Tiberius Caesar, at full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th hour to the 9th, manifestly that one of which we speak. St. Matthew, an independent, so that's 2 sources, non-Christian, talking about it going dark. St. Matthew, an independent eyewitness, again confirms the Gospel of Matthew about an earthquake which occurred, which is written about on the outside of the New Testament, and it's supported by archaeological and hostile witness statements. So Matthew 27 writes about the earthquake. He says, "Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. At the moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, the earth shook, the rocks were split." There's two different things right there, but we're going to go over one of them first. Geologists Jefferson B. Williams, Marcus J. Schwab, and A. Bauer examined the disturbances in sedimentary rock deposits to identify two earthquakes, one large earthquake in 31 BC and another smaller earthquake between 26 and 36. More details on this in 2011 when a trio of geologists, Williams, Schwab, and Bauer, took core samples of the earth near En-Gedi, just to the west of the Dead Sea, and found evidence not only of the 31 earthquake described by Josephus. So Josephus also describes this earthquake, the Jewish historian viewed as the most reliable and sound historian in history, but also another that clearly had deformed the sediments in the core samples in the year 31 AD. So an earthquake that happened after 31 AD, but it was so bad that it messed up the sedimentary rock from the earthquake from 31 AD. Plus or minus a narrow window of 5 years on each side of this date, easily overlapping the crucifixion of Jesus. According to these geologists, this earthquake was not a terribly intense one, but nevertheless, it was still energetic enough to disrupt the sediments of the rock in the En-Gedi area. That this earthquake affected mainly what was exposed sediment at this time. These three geologists concluded that the sedimentary disturbance in their core samples clear scientific proof of the earthquake in the Gospel of Matthew. Now we have strong evidence the earthquake did occur, and it left sedimentary disruption, which correlates with the place and time according to Matthew. As far as the temple being torn in two, we have Seneca, who cites a case of a certain bronze statue he surveyed, which split in half from top to bottom during that earthquake. I am not surprised that a statue was split apart from top to bottom in an earthquake. Josephus states that Herod attempted to redesign and rebuild these foundations to correct the fault. So Josephus talks about Herod trying to fix what the earthquake did with the temples, the upper levels of the temples, and remain unstable and susceptible to earthquake damage. Thus, it is certain that the earthquakes of the crucifixion caused some damage, at least to the upper reaches. And AD 41, King Agrippa also made plans to repair this aspect of the temple, probably owning partly of the damage of the temple, the crucifixion, but those plans remain unrealized until his death in 44 AD. And Paul runs it actually into King Agrippa as well. There is more. I can get into this in depth, but you get the point. This is what we will showcase from now. Just like Bill and Bob with his left hand, the same rare size shoe. What are the chances that people who were not Christian documented events which were happening during the crucifixion, which led to the resurrection? Notice they didn't deny these events occurred. These events describing by a hostile witness like the darkening of the sun, they were trying to figure out what was going on. They were trying to explain it away. Next, the behavior of the eyewitness. The people who reported the risen Jesus behaved in a way which would correlate with his life-changing experience. So, how do people behave after they experience the resurrected Jesus? Does that support a resurrected Jesus? The more people involved, by the way, it is harder to keep a conspiracy lie going. And my anecdotal experience as a Leo is I've had family members flip on each other over a shopping charge at Walmart. Watergate with Nixon is no different. This, of course, is a greater, more complex example with a misdemeanor theft at Walmart, but it does highlight the more at stake, the greater the variables, the truth generally does come out. Behavior and actions after the fact of a life-changing event can help navigate through false and truth as well. Many cases of a husband or a wife and their spouse go missing. They're on a dating website the next day. They go on a vacation. They go to the Bahamas with a husband and wife missing. So behavior of a person as well can support a conclusion. This does not correlate with the mourning spouse who is missing or had died with no foul play. That's the same with the apostles. They just didn't go off and continue to be fishermen. They continued to be fishers of men. How did they behave after they reported Jesus appeared to them post-crucifixion? Well, remember, their marching orders by Jesus was to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So James the Greater, the head church of Jerusalem, beheaded at Jerusalem, 45 A.D. Peter, the head bishop of Rome, crucified in Rome, and his head downward in 64 A.D. Andrew traveled to Russia, Turkey, Greece. He was hanged from an olive tree at 70 A.D. Bartholomew, he went to India and Armenia, then was flayed alive. Thomas, doubting Thomas, Syria, India, Iraq, he was either stabbed or burned alive at 70 A.D. Philip, he went to Africa, Asia Minor, and he was crucified at 54 A.D. Matthew, he went to Iran and Ethiopia, and he was beheaded in a distant city in Ethiopia in 65 A.D. Nathaniel, he was crucified in 70 A.D. And James the Lesser was thrown from a pinnacle off the top of the temple and then beaten to death with a club in 63 A.D. Simon, Turkey, Greece, Rome, and then many others, and he was crucified in 74 A.D. Judas Thaddeus, Syria, Iraq, Turkey, beaten with sticks. Matthias, the Caspian Sea, the area, and he was stoned on a cross and then beheaded. John, put in a cauldron of boiling oil, but escaped by a miracle, later banished to the island of Patmos, where he died of natural death. So the only eyewitness, probably because he's the only eyewitness or only apostle who got it up with the resurrection or the crucifixion, is my guess. God showed him mercy for that, I think. That's just my theory. Paul, after various tortures and persecutions, he was beheaded in Rome, was put to death in Rome just like Peter was, 69 A.D. Mark, he died after being dragged through the streets of Alexandria. Luke, he was hanged on an olive tree in Greece. Jude, he was shot to death by arrows. That's Jesus' so-called brother. Barnabas, he was stoned to death in Saloncia. Not one apostle changed their claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Not one. And this was predominantly done by hostile government bodies, so they still didn't lie and say such. So remember, it wasn't like Paul wrote a letter about him dying and believing in Jesus, and everyone got it. It was reported by them. It was not disputed that they believed what they believed, because it was probably done in the public. A lot of this sounds like it was done in public. One of them thrown off a temple, beheaded, crucifixion was done in public. You can't sit there and lie and say, yeah, well, Peter and Paul and Simon and Jude and all these dudes, all of our apostles, they all denied Jesus, and then they were put to death, because then everyone would know you're lying. So they didn't even attack that. So that gives even more evidence. And this was by hostile witnesses. People who don't like Christians. They all went to their deaths proclaiming that Jesus had died and rose from the dead. He's the Son of God, the eternal Son of the Father. Through his sacrifice, we have eternal life. Jesus gave the marching orders, Matthew 28. This is what they did. Their behavior supports that marching order by Jesus. Their behavior supports as if they had met the risen King post-resurrection. If you dig a little deeper into the behavior of the people who witnessed the resurrected Jesus, ask yourself this: what would cause St. Paul, a prized Jewish student taught by the famous Rabbi Gamaliel, to abandon all of that, be persecuted, shipwrecked, beaten, imprisoned, hunted down because he's claimed to have seen the risen Christ? What would cause Paul to do that? Saul to Paul, what would cause him to do that? What would cause him to do that? People flip from Democrat to Republican, Republican to Democrat all the time. It's because some type of event occurs. I don't support this candidate anymore. I don't support this way of life. People do this all the time, but it's because of some type of massive event that changes in their landscape of their life. What happened to Paul for him to do that? And him for getting beaten and in prison, didn't care. Think about all the religions in the area of Rome. None were given the harsh treatment like Christians were. What would prompt the government to act like this? Why would the government act like this against a bunch of first century Jews that believe in the Messiah, Messianic Jews? I'm sure some of it had to do with the radical teachings to them, like Galatians 3, where Paul wrote that slave or free, we're all one in Christ. That's radical. I would also see it being because Jesus was and did miracles all the time. Celsus, the Roman enemy of Christians, accounts for this. Would probably be pretty scary to think about it in their perspective. You got this Jewish guy walking around, a carpenter from Nazareth, which is like the slums, and he's And him and his followers are teaching everybody that there's no difference between everyone, Greek or Jew, male, female, slave, free, we're all one in Christ. And he's running around doing miracles, which they never denied happened. Celsus didn't deny the miracles happened. He just tries to make an account for it. Just like they account for the sun going, or the sky going dark. So they don't deny it happened. What's funny is people watching this video will deny that stuff happened, but they believe that their perspective is closer to the eyewitness and the historical event of the people who watched it, or the people who reported from the people who watched it. That's wild. That's that inconsistency of the 408 stop that I was talking about earlier. That's the inconsistency there. Now you're skeptical because you don't like the conclusion that comes to it. Point blank, the miracles of resurrection, I see it as a cause and effect to give reason to why they were persecuted. They were scared to death. Independent eyewitness, because the Bible says so. Yeah, well, yeah, because it's reliable. The Bible is reliable. When it comes to the amount of papyrus we have, it becomes clearer now why we can assemble the original autograph. The New Testament was never a closed transmission. It was an open transmission. And I would love to speak about this with somebody. If you're, again, this is another challenge. So Homer, there's 643 copies of, I'm sorry that this is not a very good photo. Homer's Odyssey, Iliad, they only have, 8 copies, 600 copies. All these writings, the earliest gap they have is 400 years, 1300 years, 1300 years, 400 years. Here's the New Testament. Date written 50 to 100 AD. Earliest fragments we have is from the 1st, 2nd century. And we have 5,366 pieces of papyrian copies. And at 325, we have the complete New Testament. And in the mid-250s, we have most of it. And in the 200s, we have books of it. But no one disputes Homer, Odyssey, Iliad, Plato's writings, if any of that is authentic or not. But look at the comparison. It's an absolute joke. Here's a clearer picture. I did a little better. Look at that. Look at that. The gap between the original and the copy. Herodotus, Plato, Caesar, Tacitus, 1,000 years, 1,000 years, 1,300 years, 1,300 years. New Testament, 50 years, plus or minus. And that's being extremely critical because, again, James had to have been written by James before James was put to death and martyred. The New Testament passes the forensic statement analysis lens. I've done videos on this. Go check it out in my library. It's extremely boring, I know, but it's massively powerful. Massively powerful. It proves that the New Testament writings could not have been faked. There's too much intricate detail inside of the writings. They cross-reference after cross-reference after cross-reference after cross-reference. And I'm going to give you some examples about details with inside details that can't be faked. It can't be faked. So Paul sends a letter to the church of Corinth and Timothy. In 1 Corinthians 4, Paul writes the letter to Corinth and says Timothy from Ephesus is on his way, meaning the letter had gone before Timothy. Following? That correlates with the travel we read about what Timothy did and the historical fact that letters were sent via boat, which is faster than Timothy via foot. So we literally have a track of how they went to Corinth. It can be, parts of it can be picked up through Acts and some of Paul's writings. And it literally correlates and does not contradict just a simplistic notion that he's sending him, and that means the letter got there before him, which means he sent him before the letter. It also goes to the historical fact that letters were sent by boat where he was at historically. I mean, come on. St. Mark on Peter. It is known Mark wrote the teachings of Peter. It is written in its style supporting this, i.e. Peter shows utmost respect by Mark. He does not identify Peter's shortcomings. It's detailed in the other Gospels, and we talked about that earlier. St. Luke is written by a guy who's like a physician or a doctor. and his intricate detail to historical titles and names that he uses. I could do a 5-hour video on it just on itself, like how he calls people certain by rulers and everything. It goes with historical accuracy of those times, the exact titles he uses. It's awesome. Luke is a beast. All right. John calls Mary Jesus' mother. Remember, he's the one that got the marching orders from Jesus to watch after the Theotokos. John had the marching order, meaning he viewed her as his own mother. Behold my mother, as the God-man said to St. John. He would never call her Mary like the other people do. Just like we would call our own mothers by their first name. He called her Mary, or excuse me, he called her sorry, I had a brain fart. He called her Jesus' mother. It's on the title. About an hour and 10 minutes. Sorry about that. Just like we wouldn't call our own mothers that. Pretty simple. And here is cross-reference after cross-reference after cross-reference of the New Testament. Here's the New Testament on the right side, that long line, the left, Old Testament, and it's just cross-referencing itself over and over and over and over again. So imagine back to Bill and Bob for the first bar fight that we talked about earlier. Imagine that scenario. So where the eyewitnesses about the bar fight. Several of the eyewitnesses who witnessed the bar fight all reported Bob was the aggressor. Now, imagine if all the people who reported Bob as the aggressor were actually Bob's family, like his dad, brother, sister, mother. They told the officer, "We love Bob, but he's wrong, and we're still going to report the truth." This is how the New Testament reads from a forensic statement analysis lens. The New Testament reports all the apostles beside John, meaning all the apostles did not man up going to the crucifixion and stand next to Jesus. The New Testament calls out all the bad things that the apostles do. Like, for instance, if you find a painting of a king and he's like not an attractive man, and then they paint it, he looks like Brad Pitt, then that's the king wanting to be praised more than what he's worth. That was a common thing back then. Maybe might not look him as heavy, maybe make him look slaying a dragon or some wild beast, like they're brave, things like that. The New Testament doesn't hold back. New Testament calls out the people in the New Testament all the time. This brings validity to the eyewitness, just like if Bob was called out by all of his family members. The New Testament reports that women were the first at the tomb. Women, not the apostles, the women. And they're the ones that reported the tomb being empty. Historically, women's testimony was nothing compared to a man's, but God being God and not bending to social norms at the time, just like he does not today, by the way. He said, so what? The writers of the New Testament knew this. However, put that in there for the readers to see. This shows authentic experience was what the authors wanted to relate to the reader, not what the reader wanted to hear. So many more examples like this. Peter denies Jesus, Peter being a massive influence of the church. However, it was still reported. The so-called brother of Jesus, James, the Lord's stepbrother, not believing Jesus was the Son of God, and then experienced his resurrection. James leads the first council in Acts 15. He didn't even believe his brother. St. Thomas, not believing the apostles telling him Jesus rose, even seeing Jesus in person, he still did not believe until he touched Jesus' crucifixion. John 20:28, this channel. The list goes on and on and on. You get the point. This reporting of situations which are an embarrassment to these people helps bring evidence. Again, this is just circumstantial, but just like the left-handed guy with a size 13 and bleach in his house and all that, having a key, it's this accumulation of circumstantial evidence. So here's an example of how accurate the transmission is. Because remember, you're like, well, I don't trust the New Testament. I just can't trust it. Okay. Here's an example of the New Testament when the transmission, even when it's compared to an outside source. So in John 4, Jesus and the Samaritan woman are talking by the well. This is how detailed the New Testament is. And remember, this is written by John, not a historian. Not a historian. In John 4:22, Jesus makes an odd statement when he says, "You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." What does that mean? Well, there's an historical reference to that. Let's cross-reference to the first century Jewish historian Josephus. We spoke about him. Let's speak about him again. He writes in the Antiquities, Luciana 12:5, we find the description of an event he records before the Old and New Testament. It's about 400 years ago, Josephus writes about this. Josephus describes Antiochus, the Greek king, who laid siege in Egypt, Macedonia, and Israel. So this Greek king, the Mad King, that's what I call him, he was tearing up through Egypt, Macedonia, and Israel. And the Antiochus believed that he was a god man. It's crazy. The Samaritans were directly in the path of Antiochus and his marching orders as he was conquering the land. So the Samaritans were like in his way. So he's like a tornado ripping through there. And here is the Samaritans sitting there, and they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Chill out. So the Samaritans send him a letter and say, hey, we saw how the Jews were suffered. We don't want to be with them no more. We ain't got nothing to do with them. And Josephus writes about this. Josephus telling the reader that the Samaritans dissociated with the Jews in fear of the Mad King. And the Samaritans dedicated their own temple to the Mad King. And it was called the Temple of Jupiter Hellenius. Okay? So, and the woman at the well references this event 400 years ago. And she says to Jesus, "Sir, I perceive you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where we people ought to worship." So what we have here is the Apostle John writing about an interaction between Jesus and the woman at the well. And this preservation of this conversation has been passed down to us. And it is even tested versus outside sources in Josephus, a non-Christian, who affirms this historical event. So that's a massive piece of evidence that the New Testament, we have the original autograph, and it's even being reported what was actually said, because it's correlating with historical events which occurred 400 years prior to them, and it matches with what a Jewish historian writes about 100 years later, reflecting about what happened 400 years before Christ, because Josephus is post-Christ. If anyone stole anything, it would be Josephus stealing from the New Testament. What about physical and archaeological evidence? Well, we're getting close. And I appreciate your time for staying here with me. I tried to keep it under an hour and a half. That was my goal. This is a very short presentation. I could have probably went a lot longer. Oh, I know I could have went a lot longer than this, but I tried to do an hour and a half. Okay. This is important because remember, the New Testament is being viewed and dissected as if we would in an affidavit. So if there is a description of a place where Jesus performed a miracle, at least one should do is prove that that place even existed at first. And if it does give some weight to the claim. So we got to be able to prove these places existed. So yes, you can prove that that place where Jesus was crucified did exist. But I'm taking it a step further. That place is proven to exist. I'm taking it a step further because remember, I'm trying to prove the authenticity and the reliability of the New Testament, because the New Testament is the vast majority of the evidence that we have and the eyewitness that we have to support the resurrection of Jesus. So the location of the incident, and that's very important now, location of incidents and being able to prove where something happened is extremely important. It literally determines who can take the crime or not, whose jurisdiction it's in or not, even if it's impossible or not. Okay. Another thing to consider as we go over some of these, the scripture spoke about how and describe locations which were not even discovered by archaeology until a few decades ago. So the New Testament then again describes about a certain place, and somebody might not believe that place existed, and they could have died until the 1980s believing that the New Testament was wrong because no one ever found that spot, and guess what? It was found. All right. So, and this gives strong independent evidence that there's claims that of describing spots. What are some of those spots? Well, scripture teaches that Jesus' hometown was in Nazareth, and that's in Luke 4:16. In 2009, British Israeli archaeologist Alexandra announced the first archaeological proof of a home in Nazareth. The existence of the office of Pontius Pilate, that's it in the bottom right corner. There it is, Pontius Pilate, the very man who tried Jesus, right there, has been verified and mentioned by ancient historians as Josephus, Philo, and Tacitus. Not only does is Pontius Pilate, identified by 3 non-Christians like Josephus, Philo, and Tacitus. But it's also represented, of course, in the New Testament as well. And we have a rock with his name on it. Come on. So we have evidence that the person tried him at his crucifixion. He was a real person. All right. The location of Jacob's well is another one. You can pause the video and read the description, but John and Luke, they use specific language which could only be applied to that type of well that was used to describe that was being interacted with Jesus. The pool of Siloam was not discovered until 2004, and that's the very well in the Gospel of John in chapter 9. I mean, it's like this New Testament, which is saying these things actually occurred, is pretty reliable. Again, you can pause that and read that. It gets pretty deep. It's pretty impressive. And again, we spoke about Luke earlier about how accurate he was and how intricate detail the language that he used in his writings. So Luke refers to Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods in Acts 16. Not a big deal, right? You just probably glanced over that. As a result of inscription, we now know that Thyatira had many trade guilds, and one of the most dominant was the product of purple dye. Indeed, 15 of 28 inscriptions found in Thyatira regarded dye were related to this trade of purple dye. So Luke's even referring to a historical event where these people historically sold purple dyed items, and it was passed down in correct description to us by Luke in Acts, because Luke wrote Acts. Caiaphas was Ananias' son-in-law, and John 18:13 notes, as we know from Josephus, there's Josephus again, as he was a high priest from the years of 18 to 36. Ananias had been high priest from 6 to 15. Mosaic law, Numbers 35 to 28, implies that the high priests were still called by that title even after leaving office. This easily explains Luke 3 to the high priesthood of Ananias and Caiaphas. Matthew calls Caiaphas the high priest twice. So that's pretty impressive, where again, John's not a historian, but he's writing about his experiences, and it correlates with even the practices all the way back to Numbers. Now here's the smoking gun. Now this is something that thousands of hours of videos can be done on. Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin. Quick facts about the Shroud of Turin before you roll your eyes. It's the most studied piece of artifact in history. History. Oh, you never heard of it? Yeah, that's probably because the conclusions that people have when they study it, they don't like the conclusions. Because it screams phenomenon, amazing, unexplained, miracle. It's just a fact. I have a video of it on my library. There's far much better people than me. Go look up Gary Habermas or Greg Habermas and go look him up. Dr. Habermas, type in the Shroud of Turin. Go debunk them. Good luck. Imagine on both. So this is what the Shroud of Turin has. So this is the burial cloth of Jesus. I did a video on this, on how the physical features that describe Jesus, I look at it as a cop would read it and try to figure out what the suspect looks like. It matches the person, the three-dimensional object underneath the Shroud of Turin, because there was a three-dimensional object underneath it. They didn't slightly lift it off, none of that stuff. Imagine on both the front and the back of the cloth implies that the cloth collapsed into and through the body. The image on both the front and the back of the cloth implies the cloth collapsed. Okay? The image shows the whole body. However, not all areas of the cloth come into contact with the whole body. It shows the whole body, but the cloth did not touch the whole body. The image is only the utmost surface of the fibers. Thus, it could not have been formed by some type of chemical. So it only went to the top of the fibers, didn't even go through. According to Jackson, an intense burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation produced a discoloration on the upmost surface of the shroud's fibers without scorching it, which gave rise to a perfect three-dimensional negative image of both the frontal and dorsal parts of the body wrapped in it. We currently do not know of any natural cause of a human corpse producing ultraviolet radiation like this. They're trying to figure it out, like Celsus and all them goons back in the day. How else could this shroud have done this? Jackson deduced that the vacuum UV radiation is the only possible explanation for the image's formation. First, in order to turn linen into a perfectly photographically sensitive material, you need a light radiation. However, it must be without any accompanying heat radiation. The formation of the shroud's image would take several billion watts of light radiation, which exceeded the maximum output of any source of UV radiation known today. If the accompanying heat energy would have been present, the cloth would have been vaporized in less than 1/40 of a second. Composition of the cloth material on the thread consists of known first-century plants, 3-to-1 herringbone patterns known documented in other first-century textiles, faults found in the weave consistent with first-century techniques. So it's made like it was from the first century. The dimensions of the cloth match the cubit measurements used by Jewish law and custom of burial cloth, mentioned by the documentary on the shroud. So that's my time for right now. I tried to do it in an hour and a half. I probably will make a part 2 and a part 3, as many as I can, because this is just the beginning of the tip of the iceberg. And really digging into the New Testament and proving how reliable it is a massive blow to anyone who has an argument against the reliability of the New Testament. It's without question. But I tried to show you here a different perspective, because most of the time people try to present the evidence of the resurrection. Well, people died believing it. And I'm not saying these aren't good arguments. I just use some of them. But I try to give you, if I was to write, or if I was to prove it in a courtroom. Just like we proved the left-handed large man killed his buddy with circumstantial evidence. I not only used circumstantial evidence, I used physical evidence, and I used eyewitness evidence, and I used expert witness evidence, or eyewitness evidence like Luke, and I used hostile witness evidence that said the same thing, reported the same thing that the people who claim to love Jesus did. Or not claim, but who did love Jesus. So it is a mass. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. I believe the shroud to be the actual burial cloth of Jesus. I don't say that because I'm a Christian or because I'm an Orthodox Christian. I say it because that's where the evidence leads. That's where the evidence leads. You can't else explain it. You want physical evidence, you have it. You don't agree with it now, probably, if you're a skeptic, because you don't like the conclusion. Well, what you need to do is you need to go and you need to find out why you don't believe it. You just can't say simply, I don't believe it. That's a lazy argument. As I discussed earlier, you are not the authority. You do not determine what is and is not true. You have to, and simply claiming it isn't true is not an argument. Okay? It's just an assertion. You have to give an argument. So why is the shroud not true? Why is the shroud not true? Because you don't believe in miracles? That's not an argument. Why is the shroud not Jesus's? Why? And duplicate it. You like science so much, duplicate the shroud. Good luck. How do you explain the eyewitness? How do you explain all of them going to death believing this? How do you explain people who hated Jesus and hated Christians writing about the same phenomenon, the circumstantial evidence that occurred, like the earthquakes and the sun going dark and all that stuff? How do you explain that? How do you explain that? You can't just simply wish it away because you don't like the conclusion. Okay? It looks like I'm going to do it in under an hour and a half. That was my goal. I really appreciate you watching this with me and staying here and keeping me company. And I will make another video on this in the future. And, please, questions, comments, leave it down there. And God bless you. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. Glory to the Father, Glory to the Son. Glory to the Holy Spirit. Amen.